A spoon enters a bowl of sugar. A simple motion, repeated 1,000 times in 1,000 kitchens, every single day. You don't think about it, you just taste it. Sweetness arrives, and your brain responds before your mind even asks a question. But that simple action connects you to something far older than civilization, far older than agriculture, far older than the written word. So, when did humans first taste sugar? It sounds like a simple question. It isn't. There was no first bite, no single moment, no ancient ancestor who bit into a fruit and changed history in an instant. The real answer is scattered, across fossils, across fossilized teeth, across cave walls, across a swamp in the highlands of New Guinea. Piecing it together means reading evidence that was never meant to be read. Here is the real shape of the story. In one sentence, the craving arrived tens of millions of years before the sugar did. The taste for sweetness is ancient. The abundance of it is not, and almost everything else in this story is the long, slow gap between those two facts, finally closing. Imagine a forest that no longer exists. Northern Egypt, more than 30 million years ago, when the region was thick, wet woodland instead of desert. Somewhere in that canopy, small primates move between clusters of fruit, judging ripeness by color, by smell, by taste. Not monkeys or apes as we'd recognize them, ancestors of both. They had a choice: hard nuts and seeds, tough and durable, protected by shells that take real effort to crack, or soft, ripe fruit, yielding easily, packed with sugar an animal could burn almost instantly. In a world with no stored food and no guarantee of tomorrow, that choice mattered. Sweetness was not a luxury. Sweetness was a signal. Sweetness was survival. Whichever way an animal leaned would leave a mark. Not in memory, but in the hardest tissue in its body. Teeth do not lie about what has passed over them for years. Researchers examined 421 fossilized teeth from that Egyptian fossil bed, the Fayum Depression, one of the richest sites anywhere for understanding how monkeys and apes got their start. The team, led by dental anthropologist Ian Towell, was looking for two things: chips from biting something hard, and cavities linked in living primates to a diet of soft, sugary fruit. Only about 5% of the teeth showed any chipping at all, a strikingly low number compared to primates today that regularly crack nuts or seeds. The cavity patterns told a different story, one that pointed clearly toward fruit, eaten often, eaten early. Towley put it simply: the evidence hints at a preference for soft, sugary food. That's a straight line from an animal that lived 30 million years ago to the receptor sitting in your mouth right now. A gene called TAS1R2, present across the primate family tree. Cats never got it. Their version is broken. A house cat has never tasted sweetness and never will. Primates kept it and sharpened it because animals that could detect sugar from a distance got a reliable source of energy, and animals that couldn't, didn't. We like to imagine our ancestors as lean, tough, meat-focused survivors, with sugar bolted on as a modern indulgence. The fossils say the opposite. Soft, sugary fruit was likely the foundation, the default, energy-efficient choice, long before anyone picked up a spear or lit a fire. The craving isn't new. It's one of the oldest instincts we have. None of this means it was easy. Fruiting seasons are short and unpredictable. Birds, insects, and rival primates all chase the same narrow window before the sugar content peaks and the fruit falls or rots on the branch. An animal with a sharper drive towards sweetness had an edge, but only if it could find the fruit fast enough and often enough to matter. Sweetness was a prize you had to compete for, long before it was ever something you could plant. That pressure didn't disappear when our own lineage split off. It changed shape. By the time early hominins were crossing the African Rift Valley, close to 3 million years ago, fruit and tree sap were a familiar reward, and something more concentrated had entered the picture: honey. It was not a dessert. It was energy, wrapped in danger. Getting it meant climbing toward thousands of insects willing to defend it violently. We have no record of the first person who ever robbed a wild hive. What we have is a painting on a cave wall in eastern Spain, the Cuevas de la Araña, showing a human figure suspended on a rope, reaching into a crevice where bees have built a nest. It's the oldest surviving depiction of honey gathering anywhere in the world, roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years old. It shows someone climbing toward danger, at a height where a fall would be serious, surrounded by insects capable of stinging repeatedly for something sweet. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it reframes what eating sugar meant for most of human history. It wasn't a habit, it wasn't a snack. Sugar wasn't something you had, it was something you earned at real physical cost, a handful of times a year, if you were skilled and lucky. That scarcity is the hinge the rest of this story turns on. Because at some point, thousands of kilometers from that Spanish cave, people stopped searching for sugar and started growing it. The evidence points to the highlands of New Guinea, where a wild grass called Saccharum robustum was domesticated into what we now call sugarcane, somewhere around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, confirmed by a major 2025 genomic study tracing the ancestry of modern cane back to that origin. Early cultivators weren't refining anything. They grew cane to feed pigs and to chew raw, sucking out the juice and spitting out the fiber. Sugar, at this stage, was still a plant you consumed by hand, in its own body. This was the first shift, from discovery to management. Sweetness was no longer only found, it could now be grown. But it still could not travel, and it still could not last. That changed in India when someone worked out how to boil cane juice down and coax it into solid crystals. Historians still argue over exactly when, somewhere between the 5th century BCE and the Gupta period, centuries later, but not over what it meant. A liquid that spoiled quickly had become something solid, storable, and tradable. In Sanskrit, they called it sharkara, grit, or gravel, the root of the word sugar itself. This was the second shift, from management to manufacture. And once sugar could be made rather than merely found, it started to move. Sailors carried the knowledge toward southern China by around 500 BCE. Centuries later, in the 7th century CE, Chinese envoys traveled specifically to India to learn the refining process, after the Tang emperor took a personal interest in the crop. From there, it moved toward Persia and eventually into the Mediterranean world, arriving in Europe as something closer to a spice or a medicine than a food. It was measured in small weights, locked in merchants' cabinets, prescribed by physicians, rare, costly, reserved for the wealthy or the sick. For most of human history, for essentially the entire span between the first crystal in India and the 18th century, that's what sugar remained, a substance most people on Earth would never taste at all. And that long stretch of scarcity left a strange trace in human bodies, not in written records, but in teeth. Across bioarchaeological studies from hunter-gatherer sites in the ancient Levant to Neolithic farming communities in China and Ukraine, researchers found a consistent pattern. As populations shifted toward intensive grain-based farming, rates of dental decay tended to rise, since starchy grains break down into the same fermentable sugars that feed decay-causing bacteria. But the story isn't as tidy as it's usually told. A 2019 reanalysis found the picture far messier than the popular version. Carries rates between farmers and hunter-gatherers overlapped by more than 70%. Climate mattered almost as much as diet. The clean image of pristine hunter-gatherer teeth giving way to ruined farmer teeth doesn't hold up as cleanly as it's usually presented. So if farming alone didn't cause the collapse in oral health we associate with the modern world, what did? In 2013, a team led by geneticist Christina Adler examined calcified plaque, fossilized bacterial DNA, from 34 skeletons spanning 7,500 years of European history. The oral microbiome shifted, modestly, when farming began. Then it stayed remarkably stable for thousands of years. It was only in the last few hundred years, with the Industrial Revolution, that everything changed again, sharper and faster than anything the Agricultural Revolution had produced. That's when the bacteria we now consider normal in a modern mouth first became dominant. 10,000 years of farming produced a modest shift. 2 centuries of industry produced a bigger one. What changed wasn't human biology, it was supply. Sugar stopped being something you climbed a cliff for or shipped in at enormous cost from across an ocean. It became something manufactured at scale, grown on vast Caribbean plantations using forced and enslaved labor, processed in industrial quantities, and shipped to Europe in volumes no earlier century could have imagined. British sugar consumption rose from roughly 4 pounds per person a year in 1700 to about 18 pounds a year in 1800. A 4-fold increase in a single century, and the curve kept climbing from there. A rarity that once took a dangerous climb or a months-long voyage to obtain had, within a few generations, become something sitting in nearly every kitchen, every day, requiring no risk and no wait at all. This was the third shift, and the one that finally mattered most, from manufacture to abundance. Not the primate tasting fruit, not the climber on the Spanish cliff, not even the crystal in the Indian pot. The rupture that actually reshaped the human body is barely barely 200 years old, the moment an ancient, deeply conserved craving was finally handed an unlimited, cheap, year-round supply of exactly what it had always been asking for. Your body was never built for that supply. It was built for scarcity, for a world where sweetness meant a lucky piece of ripe fruit, or a dangerous climb toward a guarded hive, a handful of times a year at most. The craving is ancient. The abundance is not, which brings you back to the spoon. Small, ordinary, forgettable. It doesn't ask you to climb a rope, or wait for a fruiting season, or wait for a ship to cross an ocean. It just asks you to reach for it, the way something in your biology has been doing since long before there were humans to do the reaching. The sweetness dissolving in your cup right now is answering a want that predates your species by tens of millions of years.